Hey there guitarists, Metz here, and welcome back to my channel with this new YouTube video on a topic that I think a lot of guitarists are going to be very excited about.
Modes.
Oh, modes. They are an endless topic of conversation and confusion amongst guitarists. And again, I'm not judging, I've been there myself, but my hope is that by the end of this video, you will finally have a much better and more complete understanding of modes, what they are, how to use them and practice them, and how to actually implement these modes into your playing. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Metz, and I'm a professional guitarist and music educator. I took a left turn after actually getting a master's in engineering originally to pursue my passion of music. I used my math or science brain to try to decompose music theory and the art of playing the guitar in a systematic kind of step-by-step approach, and use this to help and empower aspiring guitarists become better improvisers and players in general through a good, complete understanding of theory and fretboard navigation. Before we get into it, remember that if you want to support this channel, then it's very easy. Just simply subscribe, like the video if you actually like it, and or leave a comment below. That really helps me grow the channel and hopefully help more and more confused guitarists understand theory in their instrument. Understand that because I want to explain things in depth, my videos typically are longer, and they will include a lot of me talking and explaining the concepts, because for many guitarists, if you're confused about theory, that is what you need. You need an education. You need to sit down, study, and learn things. So even though I will put some practical demonstrations, it's going to be a lot of explaining. If you don't have the patience for this, then this is not the channel for you. And if you want to skip to other parts of the video to explore specific topics, everything will be bookmarked. So modes. What are these things? Why are they so confusing? Why do they generate so many debates on the internet? And why is it that so many guitarists either don't understand them altogether, or often think they understand them and actually start learning some of the shapes on the fretboard, but for some reason they can't really seem to actually know how they're used and how to bring out their incredible colors? Because the reality is that modes actually sound really cool. Let's take a listen. Cool colors, right? Which again, you can't really get if you're thinking of your regular major and minor scales or pentatonic scale. First, let me say I don't blame you for being confused, because for one, there is a lot of misinformation or kind of half-ass information out there about modes. And number two, typically guitarists don't understand modes because they learn them just as, again, groups of notes or dots on the fretboard, but they don't really understand a lot of prior important notions that are required to really understand modes, or in which context these modes ought to be used. And again, don't worry, this is going to make a lot of sense. So there are three main, very important notions that you really need to kind of conceptualize and understand clearly if you want to fully appreciate and understand mode. The first thing you need is a very good understanding of intervals. So what intervals are, and also how they sound, right? Every interval has a very unique color and sound associated to it, but also why they're so foundational and important to truly understand everything else in music theory. And I actually made a video on intervals, so you can click here if you want and go watch that if it's getting confusing to you. The second thing is you need a very good understanding of scale, and especially the notion of tonic. What does it mean for a note to be the tonic of a scale? And again, more about this later. Number three, again, you need to understand in which context, and by context I mean which chords or chord progressions modes should be used if you really want to hear those awesome colors. I'll try to briefly again describe or redefine these contexts here in the video, but understand that that's why a lot of guitarists are so confused in theory in general, is because typically they'll try to learn something and they don't realize that that notion they're trying to learn, like modes, circle of fifth, is based on a series of other notions that they should really understand and study before they try to tackle these more advanced concepts. Okay, so what are modes? Well, the simplest definition of modes is actually quite underwhelming, because the reality is that modes are just scales. And now the question is, do you know what a scale is? Could you define it? And you might think, well, duh, I know a scale. Here's a scale, or here's a pentatonic scale. But because you can play a few scales doesn't really mean that you actually deeply understand the concept of a scale. What is a scale? So here's a quick reminder. A scale is just a group of notes, typically 5 or more, that is used for melodic purposes, meaning to create melodies. And you need to add this because, again, there's a lot of things in music that are groups of notes. A chord is also a group of notes, but the purpose of a chord is to create harmony. So it's for those notes to be played or performed at the same time. A scale and a chord can have the exact same notes, but you think of them differently and you perform them differently. And so they're two different conceptual notions. So scales, again, unlike chord, are meant to play melodies or solos, right? Which are melodies, meaning that the notes are typically going to be played disjunctly or one after the other. Now, when you put that group of notes, so that scale, in a musical context, meaning a chord or chord progression, one of these notes is typically going to stand out as what we call the tonic of the scale. And the tonic is simply the note that sounds like home. It sounds like the reference and most consonant or resolving note of the scale. For example, if I play over a C major chord, because that C major chord is based on the note C, right? That's the root of the chord. That note will also become the tonic of the scale that I use. It will sound like the home note of the scale that I use. Now, again, in most cases, the tonic is given to you by the context, the chord or chord progression. In absence of a context, or if you're just playing by yourself without a chord or chord progression, the main way that you will showcase a note as being the tonic is by resolving your lines onto that note. For example, if I played the notes of the C major scale, if I keep playing randomly like that, it's hard to know what note is the reference. But if I do something like this, the way I created this line here with that resolution on C makes your ear think, oh, got it. That's the tonic. That's the reference. Now, once you know the tonic of a scale, you will always write down the notes of the scale, starting with that tonic in ascending order of pitch. And notice how I didn't say that the tonic was the first note of a scale, because that can be misleading. When you say tonic is the first note of a scale, what does that mean? Does that mean you have to start all your lines with that note or finish all your lines with that note? Does that mean that you have to play the notes in a specific order? No, not at all. You can play the notes of a scale in any order that you want, and it's still going to sound like that scale. So again, the tonic is not determined by an order, it's determined by the context. And it's because a note is the tonic that we start our writing of the scale with that note. I hope you get the nuance here, right? It's not tonic is the first note of the scale. Is a note is the tonic, and therefore when we write down our scale, because that note is more important and is our reference, we will begin writing the scale with the tonic. There's a little nuance. I hope you get it. Now, again, once you write down these notes in ascending order of pitch, starting with the tonic, you'll notice that these notes will be separated by a unique sequence of whole steps and half steps, starting with the tonic from each note to the next, and then ending on that same note, the tonic, an octave above. And that sequence is what determines the name of the scale. For example, in the case of a major scale, we have whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. In the case of a minor scale, we have whole, half, whole, half, whole, whole. And when you name a scale, of course, when I say D major, for example, D refers to the tonic, and then that major refers to that sequence of whole steps and half steps. Now, that definition is great, and it's the original, most taught definition of a scale. But a definition that's much more useful and important, especially with what we're about to study here, modes, is what we call the intervallic definition of a scale. See, when you go up a sequence of whole steps and half steps like this, starting with the tonic, each note will form a specific interval with the tonic. Now, if you know a little bit about intervals, you'll understand why that definition is so important. It's because each interval has a specific and unique sound. And so really, the sound of a scale is not as much determined by the sequence of whole steps and half steps itself, but more by all the intervals that that scale is made of. So for example, a major scale is made of the tonic, which we call the one or unison, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, and major seventh. Each of these intervals has a unique sound, and it's the combination of these sounds that makes the sound of a major scale. Second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. And even if I play these notes in different orders, because you're still hearing these intervals, it's still going to sound like a major scale. The minor scale will have the tonic, a major second, a minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, and minor seventh. And it sounds like this. And of course, you notice these two scales sound very different. Yet when you look at the intervals in these scales, a lot of them are in common, but the minor scale has a minor third and a minor sixth, also a minor seven, but that minor third and that minor sixth are much darker intervals. And that's why the minor scale is, generally speaking, a darker, sadder scale than the major scale. So now let's go back to modes. I just told you that modes are scales. And indeed, they literally are. For example, let me give you the definition of the Lydian mode. The Lydian mode goes from its tonic, whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half. And if we look at the intervals in this mode, we'll have our one, the tonic, major second, major third, augmented fourth, right? Because now we're going up a whole step from the major third instead of a half step. So that fourth becomes raised. So we'll say augmented fourth or sharp four. And then perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh. So if you compare this side by side with the major scale, you'll notice that these two scales are very similar. In fact, the only interval that changes between the major scale and the Lydian mode is that fourth that is raised in the case of the Lydian mode. So for example, the C major scale would be C, D, E, F, G, A, B. The C Lydian mode would be C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B. So again, you can see that C Lydian mode follows the exact definition of a scale. It's still a group of notes, make melodies with it, and it follows a sequence of whole steps and half steps. Now, it's still interesting to see already how just that raised fourth makes the Lydian mode sound very different from the major scale when you compare them side by side. Here's the major scale. And here's C Lydian. So one interval really changes the sound of this whole group of notes. This way of defining modes over here, when we're looking at C major and C Lydian side by side, is what we call the parallel definition of modes. And according to that definition, what is the C Lydian mode? It's a C major scale with a sharp 4. But you're probably used to another way of defining modes. So let's get into that. If I look at the notes of a G major scale now, instead of C major scale, the G major scale has the notes G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. And what do we see? We see that G major and C Lydian have exactly the same notes. The only difference, of course, is that in C Lydian, we are starting our pattern with the note C because C is the tonic in that case. Again, you can see, right, if you rewrite that G major scale starting with C, you get the C Lydian mode. This is what we call the relative definition of mode. So we're defining a mode in relation to another scale, another major scale, that has the same notes. And according to that definition, the C Lydian mode is what we call the fourth mode of the G major scale, because it's the G major scale that starts with its fourth note. And of course, this generalizes, and for any major scale, the fourth mode of that major scale will be a Lydian mode. Now, this definition, unfortunately, is very confusing for guitarists. The main reason is that because they see the mode as related to another major scale, they think that really when they're in a context where they could potentially play, for example, C Lydian, what they need to think about is the G major scale, is that parent scale. They think, well, great, I don't have to learn C Lydian mode. It's basically the G major scale starting with C. And this makes sense in theory, but in practice, it doesn't work. And here is why. You have to understand that if G major and C Lydian were the same thing, we wouldn't have two different names. And your life will change as a guitarist and a musician in general when you understand that two things that have the same notes are not necessarily equivalent or the same thing, or that you can think of one in place of the other. That's also something I see with relative scales, right? When guitarists think that C major is relative to A minor, and therefore you can just think of one or the other and it doesn't matter. And that comes again from the fact that as guitarists, when we learn our scales, we're used to really seeing scales as just a bunch of dots, of equally possible to play dots on our fretboard. And we don't really think about the value and the role of each of these dots. And this all has to do again with the notion of intervals. Because if I'm in G major or in a G major bass context, G is my reference. G is my one note. So each time I hit a G in my line, I will get that nice resolving sound, right? Because G is the tonic in that context. Now, let's say we're now in a context of C Lydian, and we'll talk about what these contexts are in a second, but just bear with me. Now, if I'm in a context where C is the tonic, C becomes my reference. And that same note, G, which used to be my tonic, is no longer the tonic. G is now the fifth. And it has a totally different color than it used to have when we were playing that same note in a context based on the note G. So dots on the fretboard are great to kind of visualize where you can place your fingers. But you have to go one step further and understand, what does each of these dots mean? And what that means is, what is the interval that each of these dots represent in the context that I'm in? Case in point here, if I'm in G, playing G major stuff, G is my 1. If I'm in a C bass context, G is the 5th. And as we'll see in a second, where you would use the C Lydian mode is actually not over chords or chord progressions that are based on the chord G. Instead, they will be used over typically chords or chord progression that are based on the chord C, C major, where C is your reference. For this reason, and I'll explain more in just a second, the best way to remember modes and to think about modes is using that parallel definition, not the relative definition. C Lydian is C major with a sharp 4. Sure, it has the same notes as G major, but you shouldn't even really necessarily think about that when you're trying to explore mode. Okay, so before we go any further, let's do a quick inventory of all the modes of the major scale, because so far we really obsessed over Lydian. So the first thing we'll do is go linearly, note per note, basically taking a major scale and changing its tonic from the first note to the second to the third, etc. and seeing which modes we get and what their intervallic definition is as we go through that process. So the first mode of the major scale, would start a major scale with its first note, is the major scale. But it also has a modal definition, which we call Ionian. So the Ionian mode, again, goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, like the major scale. And the intervals are the tonic, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, and major seventh. If I move the tonic to the second note of a scale, well, now my new kind of sequence of whole steps and half steps is whole, half, whole, 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 half, whole. And if I look at the intervals that I get there, I get my tonic, major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, and minor seventh. Now, this is awfully similar to the definition of a minor scale, if you look at it closely. In fact, it's literally just a minor scale with a major sixth instead of a minor sixth. This second mode is called the Dorian mode. The third mode, so if we start our major scale with the third note, we'll get the following sequence: half, whole, 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 half, whole, whole. Intervals would be the tonic, minor second or flat 2, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, and minor seventh. Then back to the tonic. Again, this looks awfully similar to a minor scale, except the second is a minor second instead of a major second. And this mode here is called the Phrygian mode. Mode number 4, we know that one is the Lydian mode. It goes whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half. And intervals, tonic, major second, major third, augmented fourth or sharp 4, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh. Mode number 5, our melodic sequence is now going to go whole, whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole. The intervals are therefore my tonic, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, minor 7, and back to the tonic. Again, this scale is very similar to a parallel major scale, but instead of a major 7, it has a minor 7, a lowered 7. Now, mode number 6 of the major scale. For the smart ones out there, you might already know what that mode is if you understand the concept of relative minor scale. What happens to a major scale if you start it with its 6th note? It's the relative minor. But it also has a modal name, which is called Aeolian. So the melodic sequence for this is whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole, whole. And the intervals are those of the minor scale. We already saw this. Tonic, major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, and minor seventh. And finally, the last mode of the major scale, which is the least useful mode of all, and we'll talk about this in a second, is what we call the Locrian mode. And this one is going to start with a half step again, and then it's going to go whole, whole, half, whole, whole, whole. Intervals for this mode are going to be minor second, so flat 2, minor third, perfect fourth, diminished fifth, or flat 5, minor 6, and minor 7. Again, if you're confused with the intervals here, just watch my video on intervals and it'll make much more sense. So this is our inventory of all the modes of the major scale. And as we can see, all these modes are very similar to either a parallel major scale or minor scale, with just one note that moves up or down. The only exception is Locrian, which is a very dissonant mode, first of all. It's not really used a lot in modal situations other than more advanced types of music, such as jazz. So if there was one mode that you don't necessarily need to really worry about, it would be Locrian. However, all the other ones are quite useful. And what we find is, again, we have 3 modes that are similar or related to a major scale. The major scale itself, or Ionian, Lydian, which is a major scale with a sharp 4, and Mixolydian, which is a major scale with a flat 7. So let's listen to those side by side. C major, C Lydian, and C Mixolydian. Lowered 7. So these three modes are what we call major modes. And the reason why is because, again, they are very similar to the major scale, but to be more precise, it's because these modes all include a major triad. So in all of these modes, we have the chord tones 1, 3, 5. And so as we'll see, these modes will typically be played over major chords. On the other side, we have three modes that are related to a parallel minor scale. We have the minor scale itself, which is mode number 6. We have the Dorian mode, which is a minor scale with a raised 6 or a major 6. And we have the Phrygian mode, which is a minor scale with a lowered 2nd. Here's the C minor scale. Here is the Dorian, C Dorian scale. And the Phrygian scale or mode. You can hear that very dissonant minor 2nd. So 3 major modes, 3 minor modes. And again, the minor modes, again, why do we call them minor modes? Because they include a minor triad, the chord tones of a minor chord, 1, flat 3, and 5. And these modes will typically be played over minor chords. Hey, I just wanted to take a quick second to talk a little bit about my Will Metz Guitar Academy. And if you're not interested, you can skip ahead 30 seconds. But if you really want to take your understanding of theory and fretboard navigation to the next level, then I created this incredible coaching program, which will include a complete A to Z roadmap, step-by-step video series that will explain everything you need to know and what you need to practice in which order to really get past that intermediate level on the guitar and jump into the advanced category. The Will Metz Academy also includes tons of very amazing, intimate, and personalized group calls, live calls that are hosted by me every single week, as well as a dynamic, encouraging, and easy to use community platform where you can share your experience, your progress, communicate with other students that are on the same journey. And that is also another way where I can actually give you 24/7 support and answer all of your questions. This system works. It's helped hundreds of guitarists understand music theory. It's super fun. It's not a quick fix. It takes a little bit of time. But if you're interested in really getting to the next level and don't want to do all this and scramble on YouTube by yourself for the rest of your life, then click the link below. If there is a link over here in the description, that means there are still some spots open. So take advantage now, click the link below. You'll be able to book a call directly with me and we can talk a little bit more about your goals and see if you're a great fit for the program and go from there. Again, click the link and I hope to see you on a call really soon. Okay, so now that we know what modes are and we understand that concept of parallel and relative definition, let's talk a little bit more about why, again, that parallel definition is much more useful and how you should really think about modes and practice them. And this has to do with the context in which modes are to be used. So where do you use modes typically? So modal context, places where you ought to use mode or where they shine the most, should be thought about in contrast with regular chord progressions in regular tonality, which means major or minor keys. In modal context, we're rarely going to see very complicated chord progressions that include a lot of very fast changing chords. Instead, modal contexts are static, vamping, or repetitive chords. So a chord that is going to kind of sit there, a single chord that will be repeated for at least, let's say, 2 to 4 measures in a piece of music, right? So that chord really sets kind of like a static atmosphere, something like this. So this was a vamping major chord, right? It was repeating a C major chord over and over again. So again, to make it very simple, tonal music is typically associated with proper chord progression. So many chords that are going to switch relatively quickly from one to the next, right? So for example, a classic 1 chord per measure progression like this. Contrast this again to what I played before, that vamping C major chord. And again, in the case of a tonal context, you're always typically going to play either the major scale, if it's a major tonal context, in a major key, or the minor scale, if it's a minor key. On the other hand, the quintessential modal progression is very atmospheric and repetitive. There's very little harmonic information in the context over which you're playing. And again, this is not always true. For those of you that are a little more advanced, you'll know that there are things such as modal progressions, right? So chord progressions that are associated to a specific mode. But even these modal progressions are typically relatively simple and repetitive. They'll involve one or two chords maximum that are kind of switching back and forth. But even though that's true, and there are such a thing as modal chord progressions, if you're just starting with this and you want to start your journey of practicing and understanding modes and learning how to use them, remember that you need to start with that vamping repetitive chord. This is really the only way that you'll really start mapping your fretboard correctly and really hearing and interiorizing the different colors of each of the modes. So over a vamping chord like this, because the context is so simple, so open, you can actually play different modes, which again have some variation of intervals, over the same chord. For example, if you're vamping a major chord, like that C major chord, as long as you play a mode that includes these chord tones, so the 1, the 3, and the 5, you can explore all the modes that include these chord tones. And we saw that there are 3 modes that include 1, 3, 5, the 3 major modes: major, Lydian, and Mixolydian. So all these modes can be technically played and even mixed together over a single repetitive C major chord. Let's listen to those. So as you can tell, all these modes sound really cool, but they definitely create or attach a different type of vibe to that same major chord. And again, that's due to the different intervals that these different modes present or include. And because all these modes have different vibes, again, there are different musical contexts that will prefer the use of one mode versus the other. For example, in a style like jazz, over a major chord, you'll probably typically play Lydian or Mixolydian. If you're in something like funk, you'll definitely mostly play Mixolydian. If it's metal, you can play Lydian. And those are all things that you'll be able to understand and realize over time as you practice your modes. Now you can see why it's really necessary to have that kind of extended chord that's played for a long period of time if you really want these colors to pop out. As opposed to a common mistake, for example, that guitarists make, where they're, for example, in a key of C major, and there is a chord progression that goes, for example, F major, the 4 chord, then to G major, the 5 chord, and then C major, the 1 chord. And some guitarists will say, okay, so over the 4 chord, I play Lydian, over the 5 chord, I play Mixolydian, and then major over the 1 chord. But really what you're doing there is not playing modes, because since you're in the key of C major, C is the reference and the tonic. So really what you're doing here is playing the C major scale. The fact that you're in a key of C major implies that C is your tonic. You're playing different lines in C major. You're playing the notes of C major in a different order, but you're still playing C major. Even though the root of these chords is different as the chord progression changes, it doesn't matter. C is still your anchor point, even in a 4-5-1 like this in C major. So when you do something like that, you're basically creating the most complicated framework possible that you could possibly use to play the C major scale. If you really want to practice your modes, you need to practice them the parallel way. Take a C major chord and start with your major scale and start moving the appropriate intervals to get the colors of Lydian or Mixolydian. Raise the 4th or lower the 7th. If you want to practice a minor mode, for example, Dorian, then take your minor scale, put on a C minor backing track, a C minor chord that repeats. Start with the C minor scale. And raise the 6th. Practice Phrygian. Start with the minor scale, lower the 2nd. This is, of course, something that should be done in every shape of that major or minor scale that you're kind of starting from. And now we can really see why that parallel definition is much more important. Because when you're trying to lay out your framework on the fretboard to practice these modes, you need to use the appropriate cage system. If you're in a context of C Lydian, remember you're going to be playing over a C major chord. So you should think of those notes in reference to the C major cage system, because that's the one that's going to tell you where your 1, your 3s, and your 5s are, and which are the most important chord tones, right? The chord tones of the chord C major. A shape, G shape, and again, you can do that work with modes in every one of these shapes. So in the E shape, here's C major, C Lydian. And again, with reference to that caged shape. And if you want to know why the cage system, again, is so important, I have a video here on the cage system, and I have a video that explains how you can learn your pentatonic scales in the cage system. And this, by extension, will teach you how you can learn any scale, really, in the cage system. So contrast this to thinking of G major and wanting to be playing C Lydian instead because they have the same notes. Well, now you're really mapping out your fretboard with G major chord tones. And so you're automatically going to play lines that don't really sound Lydian, but they're going to sound like G major played over a C chord, which is different than really playing something that sounds like C Lydian, because you're emphasizing the right notes, you're thinking of the right chord tones. And this is why you need to practice all these modes in parallel in the same cage system. So all the major modes you'll practice in this case in the C major cage system. If you're looking at the parallel minor modes in C, you'll be practicing with the C minor cage system in mind. So now again, there are such things as modal progressions. And these progressions are really just typically 2, maximum 3 chords that again are going to repeat over and over again. This is something you'll realize, for example, if you go on YouTube and type C Lydian backing track, you'll typically see a chord progression that looks like this. So this chord progression, which is basically a 1 major chord to a 2 chord, so on the 2nd degree, but that's also major. This chord progression is what we call a typical Lydian chord progression. And that progression here, unlike what we saw before, you can't mix different modes over this progression. That's a Lydian progression, meaning that it forces you to play the Lydian mode. It's associated with the Lydian mode. And again, there's a whole explanation to this, but this would make this video way too long, so we might talk about it in a later one. And again, there are more advanced exceptions. I don't want to upset any jazz police or theory police over here. There are some pieces of tonal music, for example, in a major or minor key, that will have a few chords taken from a mode. And so at that moment, you have to kind of switch from playing the major scale to playing a mode. This is all true, but don't get overwhelmed with this right now. Because even if these things are true, you have to start somewhere. And what I told you here is where you should start. You should start with the most classic and really unambiguous form of modal context, which is that static vamping chord over which you can kind of mix with the different colors of the modes. So let's finish by recapping everything that we've seen so far. We've seen that modes are basically scales. The only reason we call them modes is because they're somehow related to another parent major scale. And modes really have a double definition. The parallel definition, where we take, for example, the C major scale, raise the 4th, and we get C Lydian, or the relative definition, where we think of C Lydian as G major, starting with the 4th note. We saw that modes are all very similar to a parallel major or minor scale. And most of them, except for Locrian, include either a major triad or a minor triad. The ones that include a major triad are called major modes, namely Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. And the ones that include a minor triad are called minor modes, namely Dorian, Phrygian, and Aeolian. We also explored the linear kind of inventory or order of modes, where it starts with Ionian, then 2nd mode Dorian, 3rd mode Phrygian, 4th mode Lydian, 5th mode Mixolydian, 6th mode Aeolian, or the relative minor, and 7th mode Locrian. We saw that the most basic context over which you really want to start using modes is a vamping major or minor chord. Over a vamping major chord, you can basically play all the major modes and they're going to bring out different colors. And same thing, over a vamping minor chords, you can explore all the minor modes, which will also bring different colors based on the intervals that change between these parallel modes. Finally, we saw that the best way to really learn and start practicing those modes is to all learn them in reference to that similar parallel major or minor scale. For example, if you start with C major, if you want to explore all the C major modes, start with C major and then either raise the 4th or lower the 7th to get Lydian and Mixolydian. And this should be done in the shapes of the major C major cage system, because that's really going to properly organize your vision of the fretboard with the proper chord tones, the 1, 3, 5. On the other side with minor, same thing. If you want to practice the minor modes, in C minor, for example, you'll start with C minor, you'll use the C minor cage system, and then you'll either raise the 6th to get Dorian, lower the 2nd to get Phrygian. Okay, everyone, that's it for this video. I hope that it really made sense to you. I tried my best. It's a dense topic, so I try to make it as quick but still as thorough as possible. Again, if you want to support, click the subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, or leave a comment. That really helps. And finally, like I said, if you're interested in learning all of this with me and other students in an incredible step-by-step coaching program, then you can book a call to potentially join the Metz Academy, as we are now, as I'm recording this video, open for enrollment. If you don't see the link, that means we closed and we're full with students. Thank you so much for watching. I really truly wish you the best on your guitar journey. See you later. Take care.